In my last video, I built Gunner from Metaphor Fantasio in my latest installment of the How to Build an Archetype video series. While analyzing Dragoon, the elite archetype of the Gunner lineage, I described Dragoon as a quote-unquote discount elemental master for their weird choice of skill damage being magic in a strength/agility based archetype. Although not directly, I lamented that Dragoon's damage will be pretty low because of that, but also because of the scaling of their skills being medium damage for a late game archetype. While my intention is to see it in a realistic way by seeing its damage floor with it hitting one time, ideally, skills like this actually have a really great damage ceiling if all 3 hits land, as it essentially deals 3 times the damage. This is a journey of me discovering multi-hit attacks and why multi-hit attacks are such a great design in attack variation and how they interact with other systems in not just Metaphor Fantasio, but all games that introduce multi-hit attacks. So what are multi-hit attacks? Multi-hit attacks are simply instances of attacks either from basic attacks or skills that deal multiple hits. The number of hits can vary even to monstrous amounts, but because multi-hits exist alongside normal single-hit attacks, they usually get balanced by having less base damage. Multi-hit attacks generally exist in the turn-based gaming genre, but it is arguably equivalent to fast and agile attacks in real-time action-based games, because multi-hit attacks evoke the sense of a series of quick and successive attacks in turn-based games. There are a lot of examples of multi-hit attacks across many games throughout the years, but one great example in the Persona/Shin Megami Tensei series is the implementation of Hasotobi by Yoshitsune in Persona. Hasotobi in Persona 4 and 5 is simply to deal weak or light physical damage to all enemies 8 times. That seems like an underwhelming skill on paper, but in reality, Hasotobi is actually one of, if not the best physical damage skill in almost any game that has Hasotobi in it. This is because, while the base damage of Hasotobi seems to be low, it accumulates the small damage 8 times to even be higher than most single-hit hard-hitting attacks that are available in each game. To prove this point, a simple calculation, let's say in Persona 5's Hasotobi, the base damage of Hasotobi is 40. Persona 5's damage calculation include a quirky square root principle, so there's a square root of 40, and then multiply them by 8 for the total amount of damage a single Hasotobi can deal, which equals to 50.596 base damage. Compare that to another single hit skill in Persona 5, let's say God's Hand, with a base damage of 800, square root of 800 is 28.284, which is way lower than Hasotobi's 50.596. So needless to say, Hasotobi vastly outranks even one of the highest ranked skills in Persona 5. But to be honest, the case of Hasotobi I think is just a huge underestimation on how light damage multi-hit skills can perform really well in Persona. Because of the quirky square root principle, the number of hits inflate the damage number by a lot, making multi-hit attacks perform way more if all the hits land. Recently I was curious enough to play a certain, let's say, cultured game. Other than for the quote-unquote cultured scenes, what intrigued me the most was its implementation of the battle system. It is a roguelike deck builder, similar to Slay the Spire, but mixed in with a JRPG style of flow and gameplay. If you're curious about what I'm playing, it's Princess Synergy on DL side. In that game, I came across a rare card that says deal 8 damage 11 times. Right there, the game explicitly told me that this card is powerful with the help of proper buffs. So that got me thinking on how multi-hit attacks can benefit a lot more from buffs compared to normal single-hit attacks. And apparently, the answer to that is pretty simple, yet it changes the game drastically. I probably have to explain this as well. You guys know what a buff and debuff is, right? So, a buff is an effect that positively increases a character's overall strength or performance in combat, and debuff is an effect to negatively decrease a character's overall strength or performance. Buffs and debuffs can range to multiple aspects of the character or combat, but for this video, we'll focus on damage increase and decrease. Buffs and debuffs can vary in how they are calculated as well. They depend on how these games want to convey their damage calculations, but in the most general form, buffs and debuffs are calculated either multiplicatively or additionally. Back to the example of Persona or Shin Megami Tensei, buffs and debuffs with Tarukaja and Rakunda are multiplicative buffs and debuffs, or should I say they are a percentage buff and debuff. The perk for multiplicative calculation is that no matter which form of attacks it could be, whether it is a single hit attack or a multi-hit attack, the net increase or decrease is always the same if comparing with the same number. But when comparing different numbers, the number with higher value will have more increase or decrease from the calculation because the effect is relative to the base number. When comparing between single hit versus multi-hit that have the same value, say 5 hits of 40 damage versus a 200 damage attack, if applied with a 25% damage increase, 25% of 200 is 50, so the total is 250. For the multi-hit attack, 25% of 40 is 10, with a total of 50 per hit, times 5 is 250. It lands on the same number as the single hit variation, which means that single hit versus multi-hit doesn't really affect the equation for multiplicative alterations. Moreover, when comparing with different values, the net increase or decrease are going to be more if the base value is higher than the other. Say 400, when increased by plus 25%, is a plus 100 increase, leading to a total of 500, while 500, when increased by plus 25%, is a plus 125 increase, leading to a total of 625. In the case of Hasotobi, not only that being a multi-hit doesn't really affect the damage calculation much, because Persona's buff and debuff calculation are multiplicative, the base damage of Hasotobi is already really high that buffs with Hasotobi literally broke the game entirely. However, there's another way of calculating buffs and debuffs, which is by addition or subtraction. Simply put, additive buffs are a direct addition of a certain value of an attack. With a previous number example, 200 added by a plus 50 buff, which is the same as the plus 25% case before, is 250. However, when applied to the multi-hit counterpart, because the buff usually is applied per hit before the total of the damage are accumulated, 40 will be added by 50 equals 90 per hit, and then times 5 for all the hits is 450 damage. Merely plus 50 damage buff when applied to multi-hit attacks effectively became a plus 250 damage buff. This is what they meant with multi-hit attacks can be powerful with proper buff applications. A little while back, a small indie game just released its sequel, Slay the Spire 2, released on early access earlier this year, and it is the embodiment of how to perfectly implement both style of buffs and debuffs well. So in Slay the Spire 2, and in the first one too, just for the record, debuffs like Vulnerable that increases the damage dealt to that character, and Weak that decreases the damage output of that character, these debuffs are multiplicative values, usually around 50% for Vulnerable and 25% for Weak. This can also be amplified through multiple different gameplay features such as cards or relics. But buffs, particularly strength, is an additive value, where each point of strength increases the damage output by one value. What this entails is that while high damaging single hit attacks do well in certain scenarios, with great deck of cards and setups, multi-hit attacks triumphs over single hit attacks. What I'm about to show you is an example from a run that I did with a friend who weaponized this system and created nothing short of a miracle. So what just happens is, by using 13 energy, he converted Whirlwind that originally dealt 5 damage per hit. It was upgraded to 8 damage, amplified by 30 strength, so 38 damage per hit, enchanted that card with Figure, so it's another plus 8 to 46 damage per hit. I think he also has a miniature cannon relic that adds another 3 damage to upgraded attack to 49 damage, using this card in a pen nip turn where it deals double damage, dealing 98 damage on an enemy that has Vulnerable, which results in 147 damage per hit, and dealing those damage 13 times based on his energy count, resulting in a grand total of 1911 damage to the boss, completely 100 to 0 the boss. From a mere 5 damage per hit card up to a total of 1911 damage is the exact mechanic that I love in games like Slay the Spire 2. However, I also need to mention that the effects of multi-hits and buffs and debuffs can also be turned to the wrong way. Strength buff in Slay the Spire 2 can also be negative, turning the buff status into a debuff status, which simply just decreases damage for every minus point of strength. This can happen a lot of times in the game as well, and is very debilitating for low base damage attacks. Happens a lot with the Silent with her shifts, where the shifts in normal situation would only deal 4 damage per hit. If you have at least -4 strength, your shifts just won't do any damage. It is very debilitating compared to high damaging single hit attacks, like Ironclad's Bludgeon for example. Because a base damage of 32, -4 with -4 strength is still 28 damage per hit. The case of multi-hit attacks getting much attention is also present in Deadlock, a real-time action shooter MOBA title by Valve. Meet 7 from Deadlock. 7 is a damage carry character, dealing high amounts of both spirit, Deadlock's language for magic, and gun damage to shred and evaporate enemies. Using the power of lightning, 7 is my personal go-to character in Deadlock. If you've played Deadlock before, you'd probably realize that 7's abilities do not consist of a burst of instant damage. However, from his ball of lightning to his storm cloud, his damaging ability are multiple ticks of small damage, accumulating to bigger damage in total if enemies are exposed to 7's attacks for a long time. This is the equivalent of a multi-hit attack in a game going in real-time action. Because of this characteristic, 7 benefits a lot with items that gives a flat addition to spirit power, but also a specific item in Deadlock called Mystic Vulnerability and its upgrade Escalating Exposure, where every hit of spirit damage will decrease enemies' spirit resist and grant you Spirit Amp that further increases your spirit damage against that enemy. Because of this, 7 became a very strong damage dealer and is probably one of the go-to damage carry characters in Deadlock. It's been a long while since I've talked about this game, but the phenomenon where multi-hit attacks become very strong with interactions with other systems of the game also happens in Monster Hunter. Monster Hunter is a real-time action-based game, so it's more of a matter of slow versus fast attacks. So if you don't know, the way hunters pick their weapon is by how they like the movesets of the weapons. Some are set to have slow but hard-hitting attacks, like greatsword and hammers, while some are fast series of small, light attacks like the dual blades, and to some extent, the longsword's multiple hits of Spirit Helm Breaker. To utilize these different movesets, each weapon type will prefer different parameters for their weapon, leading hunters to choose different trees per weapon to be optimal. From all of these parameters, I'm going to only quickly mention Affinity and Element, because this dictates how you choose your weapons to craft. Affinity is simply a critical modifier, where the percentage of affinity is the chance to deal a percentage more damage per hit, essentially is a percentage multiplier buff of damage, which also can be minus to signify the decrease of damage instead. However, the most important thing that dictates how you choose a weapon tree to craft is the element. Element acts like a way to increase the damage you'll deal to monsters based on what element the monster is weak to. If you're hunting Rathalos, you'll benefit a lot with Dragon Element weapons, but not with Fire Element weapons. This bonus element damage, if you're dealing the element damage the monster is weak to, they act as an additive bonus damage on top of the final damage calculation per hit, meaning that more elements are really great with fast hitting attacks. So the faster the weapon type is, the better weapons with higher element stats are, which is very similar to each previous case with multi-hits and additive buffing skills. With all of these ramblings about multi-hits and fast-hitting attacks, what am I trying to accomplish? Honestly, I don't know. I guess I am just very fascinated by how the gaming sphere has flourished in designing multiple types of attacks in combat to be such an interesting mechanic that interacts differently with multiple different other mechanics. I guess there's one thing that I want to convey here, it's that with this analysis on some of the different games that feature multi-hits and how they interact with other mechanics such as buffs and debuffs, it's sort of a training process to naturally think to ourselves which type of feature in a game can benefit the most from the multiple stuffs that interact with multi-hit. It's hard to put into words, but I'll use some examples. Take Slay the Spire 2. Previously I went with the Silent as an example with her shifts, but they changed how Blade of Ink works. So let's take the Defect. The Defect is mainly the character that utilizes orbs that gives you extra effect on top of whatever cards you play, depending on the type of orbs. A full deck revolving around generating and evoking orbs is probably the main playstyle of the Defect. However, conversely, the Defect also have sets of cards like Bulk Up and Feral that turn the orb juggling character into a character that mainly dish out a lot of damage from their zero cost attack cards multiple times, somewhat turning the defect into a multi-hit character that also benefits on the strength buff. While it is a hard deck to set up, it is probably one of the more fun builds to play in Slay the Spire 2. Or for a different example, take Deadlock, where there's a lot of other characters other than 7 that could utilize escalating exposure, or even the opposite. Mirage seems like a gunner type of character. He deals damage by shooting the enemy, but is also helped by the mark that deals spirit damage as he applies the mark by shooting the enemy. Because the mark deals spirit damage periodically as he shoots the enemy, Mirage benefits a lot from escalating exposure, because escalating exposure's effect will apply almost immediately and periodically as he shoots the enemy constantly, increasing his overall damage by a ton. Some other characters could benefit as well, like Invernus for his burn debuff. Conversely, escalating exposure would also not be useful for numerous other characters that did not have the kit to deal periodical spirit damage, such as Vindicta, who is a bona fide sniper that one-shots low HP targets. Admittedly, I'm not a very good Deadlock player, but this handful of knowledge that escalating exposure really works well with characters that deal constant spirit damage over time helps me with itemization in-game, and quite possibly think out new playstyle or builds that you might actually have fun with. So with all these ramblings and stuffs, I hope you get to experiment a lot of stuffs or mechanics with your favorite games. Learn about new mechanics that interact with other mechanics, and utilize that interaction to essentially have fun with your game. I think that's about it with our journey into multi-hit attacks. Thank you for watching, code Izanagi on Figures.com, and I'll see you next time.